When everything fails, I go back to poetry. I don't think that this hypothesis or rumor, as the question highlights, is related to poetry. It rather tells us that Adam was a human and full of compassion. Maybe we inherited his compassion. Sorrow usually and pain and sadness are more intense than other expressions and other emotions. But to go back to your question, I think maybe Adam chanted his sadness, and as they say, tears come from the heart, not from the mind. And especially beautiful poetry and powerful poetry comes from the heart. I believe in that. I wish that I was born as a Bedouin. Unfortunately, I was born in the city, and I still remember the sounds of ships that used to cross Dubai's Creek, which was in the same area where my grandparents' house was and where I grew up. What is reflected in my poems is the city life and all these noises, and probably a little bit of my loneliness in the city. At the beginning, I was, fond of Abu Tayyib al-Mutanabbi, and when I grew up, I felt I was more attracted to modern poetry. So I was reading a lot, Khalil Gibran, Nizar Qabbani, and Mahmoud Darwish, As-Sayyab. And when I grew up, when I became in my 20s, and after that, I started reading poetry coming from the West, and I really liked poets like Rimbaud, Baudelaire, and Ezra. Like what you need to write a poem or poetry, sometimes you need a piece of paper or you need your computer. But in order to make a film, it is more complicated and more sophisticated. It is just like going through the fiction or the non-fiction, but through more artistic and technical procedures, and this is completely different, and it takes the fantasies and the fiction that might be in poetry away from the whole incidents, away from the whole story. Maybe loneliness is related to the way I was raised when I was still a child. I was raised in my grandparents' house, not with my own parents, and that left a huge gap in my life. I felt I was the smallest one at home. So everybody was adults or adult. And there wasn't much room for me as a child. I started reading when I was still in in elementary school, and I would spend most of my time alone. So that was reflected in everything I wrote later on. Poetry is the basis for every form I am engaged in. And when I go to cinema, I am loaded with all this, you know, with my language, the poetic language, and my knowledge, and my interest in a certain type of poetry. And on the other hand, cinema itself is about images, and they relate to each other through the aesthetic side, aesthetic perspective. I'm glad that you see that there is wisdom in my poetry. I think I believe that we always have to come up with something new, something different, and maybe our work can be distinguished if we bring something different to it. And that's the case not only with my poems, but also with my films and my visual art. I think we need to bring that sort of experience to the viewer or the reader. Wisdom is something that is related to every person, I think. I think what I am concerned about is how to bring an experience not only in poetry to the reader, but also through my visual art, through my films. I am concerned about creating an experience so people, they can relate to it. And you know, like if it's wisdom, or if it's something that will make people think about this sort of story or experience, that I think that is a good thing. Poetry can, you know, can mix times, like, you know, can bring us, can take us to the future, or take us back to the past. It has this capacity, and it has this quality that can mix times and bring different experiences, different levels of emotions and expressions. We relate to our past, we relate to our memories, we relate to those anecdotes in our life. And if any of these elements are reflected in our poetry, then it is something usual. You know, like we relate to all these incidences in our life. And yes, memory is a major and center of lots of things. Sometimes some poets, they can react to the current situations, current aspects, and some other poets, they need their time to reflect on what is happening in their present time. I am one of the second second example. I need always time to realize what is happening. For example, now with COVID, I wasn't able to write about it. I wasn't able to, you know, to come up with something that is related to language and related to this pandemic, for example. But I was able, for example, to make some artworks, some visual work. When it comes to language, it is more difficult to express yourself. And I am one of those who really need time to realize what is happening and to be able to reflect on it. Poetry for me cannot be explained. It is indescribable, and but it is full of feeling. And when everything fails, I go back to poetry. It has that ability to welcome me and to be there for me when I need to express myself differently.